He didn't look away. Most people do. They glance, they register you, and then they move on like you're just another passing detail in their day. But he didn't. His eyes stayed on mine a second longer than they should have, long enough for me to notice, and long enough for something inside me to shift that I should have looked away first, that I didn't, that it wasn't dramatic. No words, no smiles, nothing anyone else would have noticed. But it stayed with me long after that moment passed, like a quiet echo I couldn't shake. I told myself it meant nothing. Just a coincidence. Just a look, but I remembered it, that I remember everything now. Damn, why life at that point was fine. That's the word people use when they don't want to admit something is missing. My marriage wasn't broken. There were no fights, no betrayals, no obvious cracks. Just routines. Predictable mornings, quiet dinners, conversations that felt more like obligations than connection. That he used to look at me like that once. My husband. I try to remember when it stopped, but I can't pinpoint the exact moment. It just faded, slowly, like everything else between us. We still existed in the same space, but it felt like we were living parallel lives that barely touched. And then there was him. The second time we spoke, it was nothing important. A casual conversation, the kind you forget 5 minutes later. At least, that's what it should have been. But he listened. Not the polite kind of listening where someone just waits for their turn to talk. He paid attention. To what I said, to how I said it. To me, that it caught me off guard, that I found myself saying more than I intended. Small things at first. Then slightly bigger ones. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing that crossed any lines. But it felt different. Easy, too easy. After that, I started noticing him more. Or maybe I had been noticing him all along and just hadn't admitted it yet. The way he carried himself. The way his voice softened when he spoke. The way his eyes seemed to hold on to moments instead of letting them pass, and sometimes, I'd catch him looking at me again, not constantly. Not in a way that would draw attention. Just enough. Just those small, lingering seconds that felt longer than they were, that I should have ignored it. Instead, I started anticipating it, that I began paying attention to things I hadn't cared about in a long time. What I wore. How I looked when I walked into a room. Whether my hair fell a certain way. It wasn't intentional at first. I didn't wake up one day and decide to impress him. It just happened, and the worst part was realizing I hadn't done any of that for my husband in years. That thought stayed with me longer than it should have. Longer than I wanted. The conversations continued. Still harmless on the surface. Still safe. We talked about ordinary things. Work, daily life, random thoughts that didn't mean anything on their own. But there was something underneath it. Something unspoken, that I felt it every time he paused just a second too long before responding. Every time his tone shifted slightly, softer, more careful. Every time silence between us didn't feel awkward, just full of something I wasn't ready to name. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when everything almost made sense. We were standing closer than usual. Not intentionally. It just happened that way. Neither of us moved back, our hands brushed. Barely. It could have been nothing, but it wasn't that I felt it instantly, like a spark I hadn't been expecting. I pulled my hand back, subtle enough that it wouldn't seem obvious. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But something had changed. That was the first time I felt it clearly. Not curiosity. Not coincidence. Something else, something dangerous. That I went home that night and sat across from my husband at dinner. He talked about his day. I nodded at the right moments, responded when I needed to. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, everything felt different that I kept thinking about that moment. About how small it was. How insignificant it should have been. And yet, it stayed with me in a way nothing else had in a long time. That's when the guilt started, quiet at first. Easy to ignore. I told myself I hadn't done anything wrong. And technically, I hadn't. There were no lines crossed. No promises broken, just a look, just a conversation, just a moment, but deep down, I knew something had already begun, and the next time I saw him, I didn't avoid him, that I didn't keep my distance, that I didn't pretend it hadn't happened, that I met his eyes again, and just like the first time, he didn't look away. This time, I didn't even try. After that, it didn't feel accidental anymore that we didn't talk about it. Not directly. Nothing was ever said out loud, but something had settled between us, something quiet and undeniable. It changed the way we spoke, the way we stood near each other, even the silences we shared. They weren't empty anymore. They carried weight. That I started noticing how easily we fell into conversation, like we had skipped past the awkward phase people usually go through. There was no effort, no searching for things to say. It just flowed. And when it didn't, the quiet felt just as natural. That was new to me. At home, silence felt heavy. Like something that needed to be filled but never was. With him, it felt enough. That I told myself it was harmless, that we weren't doing anything wrong. We weren't crossing any real lines. There were no secrets, no hidden messages, no stolen touches that could be called out. Just conversations. Just presence. But I started looking forward to it. That was the first real shift. That my days began to revolve around small, almost invisible moments. A chance encounter. A passing conversation. A few minutes that shouldn't have mattered as much as they did. And yet, they became the part of my day I waited for. That I didn't question it at first. Or maybe I did, and I just chose not to listen. That he noticed things. That's what made it different. If I changed something small, something most people wouldn't even register, he saw it. Not in a dramatic way. He wouldn't point it out directly. But there would be a pause, a look, something in his expression that told me he had noticed, and I liked that more than I should have. That I started sharing more with him. Not everything. Not the things that would make it obvious something was wrong. But enough. Enough for him to understand pieces of my life I hadn't spoken about in a long time. That I mentioned my marriage once. Casually. Like it wasn't important. That he didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice. He just listened, and that made me say more. That I told him how things had become routine. How conversations at home felt like they were on repeat. How sometimes it felt like I was invisible in my own life. I didn't say it in a dramatic way. I wasn't looking for sympathy, but he understood. That I could tell by the way he looked at me. Not with pity. Not with judgment. Just understanding. That was enough. After that, something shifted inside me. That I started comparing without meaning to. The way my husband spoke versus the way he listened. The way one felt distant while the other felt present. It wasn't fair. I knew that. But once the comparison started, it didn't stop. That I told myself it was natural, anyone would feel the same, anyone would notice the difference. That's how I justified it. The space between us kept shrinking. Not in obvious ways. No one would have noticed anything unusual. But we stood a little closer. Conversations lasted a little longer. There were moments where neither of us moved away, even when we probably should have, and then there were the pauses, the kind that stretched just enough to make you aware of them, the kind that make your heart beat a little faster for no reason you can explain. That I started recognizing those moments as they happened. Not after. Not later when I had time to think. Right there, in real time. I knew what they meant, and I didn't stop them. That was the part one avoided thinking about, because stopping it would have been easy in the beginning. A step back. A shorter conversation. A decision to create distance. It wouldn't have taken much, but I didn't do any of that. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was. There was one moment I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I tried to downplay everything else. We were alone, not intentionally, but long enough for it to matter. The conversation had slowed, fading into something quieter. He looked at me differently that time, not subtly. Not in a way I could pretend not to notice. That it was clear. There was no confusion left. For a second, everything in me told me to step back. To say something neutral. To break whatever was building before it crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That I felt it. That instinct. That warning, and I ignored it. That I held his gaze instead. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't change everything. And somehow, we both understood that. The silence stretched, thick with something neither of us named, but it was there. That it had been there for a while. This was just the first time it was impossible to pretend otherwise. That I remember thinking, just for a second, that this was the moment where I could still walk away. Where I could choose to let it end before it became something real. Nothing had happened yet, not really, but something inside me had already crossed that line. Because I didn't move. That I didn't create distance. That I didn't remind myself of what I had at home, or what this could cost, or how easily things could fall apart. That I just stood there, and let it exist. That was the moment everything changed, not because of something we did, but because of something I chose not to stop. After that, there was no pretending anymore. That we never said it out loud, but we both knew, and the worst part was, I wasn't afraid of it. That I was waiting to see what would happen next. After that, everything moved faster, even when it didn't look like it from the outside. Nothing about our behavior changed enough for anyone else to notice. We were still careful. Still controlled. Still staying just within the lines that made everything look normal. But internally, there was no balance left. Whatever hesitation I had before was fading, replaced by something stronger and harder to ignore. That I started thinking about him when he wasn't there. That was new. That it wasn't just the moments we shared anymore. It was the anticipation of them. The replaying of small details in my mind. The way a single look could stay with me for hours, sometimes longer. I would catch myself drifting, losing focus on things that used to matter, pulled back into thoughts I knew I shouldn't be entertaining, and every time I noticed it, I told myself the same thing: stop. But I never did. That we began finding more time to be alone. Not intentionally planned, not in ways that could be pointed out or questioned. It just happened. Small windows of time where everything else seemed to fade into the background. In those moments, the distance between us felt almost non-existent. Conversations became quieter. Slower. More deliberate. Words carried more weight, even when they were simple. And sometimes, we didn't speak at all. We didn't need to. That silence had become something else entirely. That I knew where this was going. There was no confusion left, no uncertainty about what we were doing or what it meant. The only thing left was the choice to stop it, and I didn't. The first time it almost happened, I felt it building before either of us moved. It was in the way he looked at me, steady and unguarded. In the way I didn't look away. In the way the space between us seemed to shrink without either of us stepping forward. For a moment, I hesitated, not because I didn't want it, but because I understood it. Fully. Clearly. I knew exactly what crossing that line would mean. There would be no going back to pretending after that. No more harmless conversations. No more justifications that it would be real, and it would be wrong. That thought should have been enough. It should have stopped everything right there. But it didn't, because underneath the guilt, underneath the awareness of consequences, there was something else. Something louder. A feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time that I felt wanted, not out of habit. Not out of obligation. But in a way that was immediate and undeniable. It pulled at something in me I hadn't realized was still there, and in that moment, that feeling mattered more than anything else. The distance disappeared, there was no dramatic build-up, no words exchanged to make it official. Just a shift. A decision made without being spoken. His hand finding mine, not by accident this time. Mine not pulling away. Everything after that felt inevitable. I remember the pause right before it fully happened. That last second where I could have stopped it. Where I could have stepped back and chosen differently. I didn't. I let it happen, not because I was confused, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted it. That was the truth I couldn't hide from, no matter how hard I tried to soften it in my own mind later. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Afterwards, the silence returned, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't filled with tension or anticipation. It was heavier. More real. We both knew what we had done, even if neither of us said it out loud. For a brief moment, I felt everything at once: excitement, guilt, relief, fear. It all blended together in a way that made it hard to separate one feeling from another. I didn't know which one I was supposed to focus on, so I focused on the one that felt strongest, the feeling of being alive. That's what it was. For the first time in a long time, something had broken through the numbness. Something had disrupted the routine, the predictability, the quiet emptiness I had gotten used to, and I held on to that feeling, even when I knew I shouldn't. Going home after that felt different in a way I couldn't ignore. Nothing had changed on the surface. The same walls, the same routine, the same person sitting across from me. But I wasn't the same anymore. I noticed it in the way I avoided eye contact. In the way I responded just a second too late. In the way everything felt slightly out of place, even though it looked exactly the same. I told myself I could manage it, that it didn't have to go any further, that it could stay contained, controlled, but that wasn't how it worked, because once the line was crossed, it didn't feel like a boundary anymore. It felt like something that had been holding me back. And now that it was gone, there was nothing stopping it from happening again, and it did, more than once. Each time, the hesitation faded a little more. The guilt became quieter, easier to push aside. The justification came quicker, more convincing. I stopped questioning it the way I had in the beginning. I stopped pretending it wasn't what it was. It became something I relied on, not just him, but the way I felt when I was with him. The attention, the connection, the intensity of it. It filled a space I had ignored for too long, and once it was filled, I didn't want to go back to the way things were before. That's when I realized it wasn't just about a moment anymore. It wasn't just about crossing a line. It had become a part of my life. A secret one. And secrets like that don't stay hidden forever. I started noticing small things. Subtle shifts. The kind you wouldn't pay attention to unless you were already on edge. A question asked differently. A look held a second too long. A pause where there hadn't been one before. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it was everything, but for the first time since it began, I felt something stronger than desire. I felt the possibility of it all falling apart, and I knew, deep down, that if it did, there would be no way to fix it. It didn't collapse all at once. There was no single moment where everything shattered in front of me. It happened slowly, in small cracks that spread until there was nothing left holding things together. First, it was just a feeling, that quiet sense that something was off. The kind you try to ignore because acknowledging it would mean facing something you're not ready to deal with. I noticed it in the way my husband looked at me sometimes. Not suspicious. Not accusing. Just different, more aware, like he was starting to see things he hadn't noticed before. That I told myself I was imagining it, but then the questions started, simple ones. Casual. The kind that don't sound like questions at all unless you're already hiding something. Where I had been. Why I seemed distracted. Why I wasn't as present as I used to be. That I answered them easily at first, too easily. The lies came out smoother than I expected, which should have scared me more than it did. Instead, I treated it like control. Like I had everything handled. Like I could keep the two parts of my life separate without them ever colliding. That illusion didn't last, because the more I tried to act normal, the more unnatural everything felt. I overthought small things. Over-explained details that didn't need explaining. Pulled away when I should have leaned in, and he noticed. Of course he did. You can only hide so much before the gaps become visible. The tension at home became harder to ignore. Conversations felt strained, like both of us were aware of something neither of us wanted to say out loud. He watched me more closely. Not constantly, but enough for me to feel it. That was when the fear started to settle in, not the kind that makes you stop, the kind that comes too late. That I tried to pull back after that. Not completely, not in a way that would end things, but just enough to convince myself I was regaining control. I told him we needed to be careful. That things were getting complicated. That he didn't argue, but something in his reaction changed. There was distance in it. Not physical, but emotional. Like the version of him I had created in my mind didn't fully exist outside of the moments we shared. Like he wasn't as invested in the consequences as I was. That realization stayed with me longer than anything else, because for the first time, I saw it clearly. What we had wasn't built for reality. That it only worked in secrecy, in stolen moments, in the space where consequences didn't exist yet. Outside of that, it felt uncertain, unstable, and still. I didn't end it. That I couldn't. By then, it wasn't just about him. It was about everything I felt when I was with him. Letting go of that meant going back to the version of my life I had already started to detach from. That I wasn't ready to face that. So I stayed in it. Even as everything around me started to tighten, the confrontation didn't come the way I expected. There was no dramatic discovery, no undeniable proof placed in front of me. Just a moment where the silence between us finally broke. That he asked me directly, not angrily. Not even loudly, just clearly, and in that moment, every excuse I had built in my head disappeared. There was no way to twist the truth, no way to hide behind half answers or deflection, because he already knew, maybe not everything. Maybe not the details. But enough that I could see it in his eyes. That was the moment everything I had been avoiding caught up to me. That I didn't deny it, that I didn't try to lie, that I just stopped, and in that silence, the truth was already there. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive in the way people imagine these things to be. It was quieter. Heavier. Every word carried weight because there was no point in pretending anymore that he didn't ask for explanations, and I didn't have any that would have made a difference, because there isn't a justification that makes something like that acceptable. Not really. Saying I felt lonely wouldn't change what I did, saying I needed something more wouldn't undo it. Those were reasons, not excuses, and they didn't fix anything. After that, the distance between us became real. Not the quiet, familiar distance we had lived with before, but something sharper. Something final. Trust doesn't break cleanly, that it fractures, and once it does, there's no way to put it back exactly the way it was. That I thought about him during that time. The other man. About what we had, what it meant, what it was supposed to become. But the more I looked at it without the illusion, the more it changed. That it didn't feel the same anymore. Without secrecy, without the tension, without the risk, it lost something. Or maybe I just saw it for what it actually was instead of what I wanted it to be. That he didn't fight for it. That was the truth I couldn't ignore. There were no promises, no attempts to turn it into something real. Just a quiet understanding that whatever existed between us had already served its purpose, and that was it. Just like that, It was over, not because I chose to end it, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. I in the end, I was left with what I had tried to escape in the first place. Only now, it was different. Now it was damaged. Now it carried the weight of everything I had done to it, and there was no one else to blame for that. I thought it would fix something, that I thought it would fill whatever was missing, but all it did was expose it. That I let it happen, every step of it, from the first look to the moment everything fell apart. There were chances to stop, to turn away, to choose differently. That I didn't take any of them. That he couldn't look away. And I let him. That's the part that stays with me, not the moments we shared, not the way it felt at the time, but the fact that I knew, and I still chose it anyway.